talk about a quick, just kind of informational short webcast on the solar eclipse. I think everyone's probably aware. Next Monday there'll be an eclipse coming across North America, and so we just wanted to give some quick information what we are seeing, where we think there's going to be potential impacts, and what that means now, what it might mean as we change and transition the energy system. So. This is really meant to be a quick overview. I'm going to hand it off to my colleagues for most of this. First of all, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Aidan Toohey. I'm the Director of our Transmission Operations and Planning Research here at EPRI, as just part of our Energy Delivery and Customer Solutions area. And then I have my colleagues David Larson, who leads a lot of our work on forecasting, as well as Daniel Kirk-Davidoff, who's in a similar role and leads a lot of work on forecasting meteorology. And then Miguel Ortega-Vasquez, who leads quite a lot of our work on operational planning tools and operational decision support tools. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it off to David to continue the webcast and let us know the logistics and how to engage. Thanks, David.
Great. Thanks, Aidan. So before we dive into the content, just a couple of logistical things. We're using WebEx for this meeting. We have a Slido Q&A option opened up. So if you have questions, please use that. You should see it on your bottom right, or you may have to click applications, and that will be how you can ask questions and upvote them to prioritize. We've muted everyone and you cannot unmute. So this is just going to be us presenting, but if there's a need for something, you can raise your hand. So Slido, do for Q&A. We'll cover this stuff in about 20 minutes, and then we'll get to some Q&A. So I'm going to start real quickly as background. I think everyone's aware of this, but it doesn't hurt to go through quickly. We're talking about the total solar eclipse that's coming up on April 8th. This is where the moon gets in the way of the sun and causes shadows on the earth. This is going to be a total solar eclipse. So if you are in the path, it's going to be much more distinct than the annular eclipse from last year. And just to compare these two, this is a nice visual from NASA. You may have seen this before, others. We have the path of last year, the October annular eclipse, which moved from Oregon down through Texas. And then we have this upcoming one, the total solar eclipse, that's going to move starting through Texas first and then going up to the New England area in the Northeast. So there's some overlap here, but this is just a very high level. That's kind of the path difference. You might be already very aware of this. Thought it's just worthwhile to show. One thing, if we just zoom in, is just to give a sense of how quickly the eclipse does move. So this is zooming in on Texas. And so the most obscuration is going to move through pretty rapidly. But as we'll talk about shortly, it's affecting the entire US just to different levels. But just wanted to show the sense of you're going from San Antonio to Dallas, which is 200 something miles in a matter of 10 minutes. So it is moving pretty rapidly. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to my colleague Dan to talk about some of the solar impacts.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so as anyone who's looked at XKCD recently knows, the coolness the visual coolness of the eclipse does indeed concentrate very closely around the path of totality. But from an energy generation point of view, it's quite a bit broader. So, those lines on either side of the path of totality there are like, 95th, 90th percentile of obscuration. So while, the sun goes through totality, that is the period of time when the sun is totally blanked out, is only a couple of minutes at any given location. The whole process of the moon first touching the sun and then coming all the way to complete obscuration, and then the last touch of the sun, that takes several hours because, of course, the moon is out there rotating around the Earth pretty slowly. It takes a whole month to go around. So it takes a good 3 hours for the whole process to happen. Nevertheless, and we can see this in the generation profile for if it were going to be a clear day on April 8th in Texas, you'd see this 3-hour process of first, about an hour and a half down ramp and then an hour and a half up ramp. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see even in places that are pretty far away. So this is for California ISO. You're getting a similar time period. You get a pretty big dip in the generation during that time. And it's, you know, a lot more likely to be pretty clear in California on this particular April 8th than it is in Texas. So like this impact will probably actually be realized. Next slide. There are a couple of interesting things to talk about in terms of the timing. So again, you know, the process of obscuration takes a couple of hours because that's how long it takes for the moon to move across the disk of the sun and then exit. And that winds up being kind of comparable and even a little faster than the ramps of the up and down ramps of solar generation at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. Now, of course, that's not because it takes hours for the sun to clear the horizon in the morning, but because it takes hours for the sun to get high enough in the sky to get the, you know, the main kick of solar generation really well established. And that process looks a little different in places like Texas. We saw that 2 slides back where it's quite a sharp on-ramp at the end of the beginning of the day, because in Texas, a lot of the solar generation is in tracking. When you're talking about behind the meter solar, which is typically fixed panels on rooftops, again, you have a slower up ramp and down ramp. So then the rate of up and down ramping of the eclipse is even more remarkable relative to the usual sun rising and setting. When you've got a system that is largely flat panels, which is the case for the behind the meter generation in both California and New York. Next slide. And then here we're looking at the, you know, the growth of the solar industry since the last eclipse. These eclipses don't happen all that often, and so a lot can change over that time. In the case of California, even though there's more solar generation now than there was in 2017, because it's a less direct the path, you know, the level of obscuration over California will be less than it was in 2017. Probably the net impacts are a little bit less. But in ERCOT, it's both a more intense solar, a larger degree of obscuration, and there's a huge amount more solar generation potential in Texas than there was at that time. So even though it's going to be pretty cloudy on the 8th, it may be that they'll see a larger dip in absolute generation during the eclipse than they did back in 17. And with that, I will hand it over to
Miguel.
On to Miguel, who will talk a little bit about what the operators are doing to prepare for these events.
Thank you, Dan. So one of the things that operators can really do a number of things to start preparing for this event. There are different strategies that they have to start adopting in order to get ready in terms of operations and the planning in advance. One of the things is really adjusting the forecast that they are going to be using for the event. The historical forecast would be of little use. So one of the things that they have to really take into account what's going to be the conditions for that specific point in the topology of the system, and potentially take advantage of probabilistic forecast that they will be giving a wealth of information of what is going to happen with different degrees of accuracy, because there might be other factors that may be affecting the eclipse, like clouding and stuff like that. So another point that they can get ready and actually should be doing is preparing the response to these rapid changes that are expected. As Dan was showing there are ramps that are very quick in terms of rate of change over minutes, and therefore there will be substantial requirements of flexibility deployed in the system in terms of headroom and in terms of rate of production changing rapidly. One item that they can also do is preparing in advance, like rescheduling non-essential work for these conditions and moving it at different time. Also, to have a little bit of more focus on congestion management in order to control the inter-regional flows, and also add potentially more operators and support staff during the eclipse in order to respond to unforeseen events. Obviously, we are trying to predict with as greater accuracy as possible to what is going to happen, but there might be unforeseen things that that may occur as well, and we have to be ready. So in the next slide, we can see the probabilistic forecast for the eclipse. This probabilistic forecast, I have to mention, that has been produced with a very rough granularity in terms of time. So please note that your system may have a completely different resolution, and actually to accommodate these scheduling operations, which is turning units on and off and changing their operating dispatch. So in this case, it was assumed that it was with an hourly resolution. So that's the reason it seems a little bit rough. But what happens here is that we can see that we have the solar production, and it has a wide spread of uncertainty. This is the different lines of different colors that change, particularly as the day progresses. Like, for instance, at 12 p.m., we can see that the uncertainty spread is quite wide. However, as we get close to the eclipse, the uncertainty starts reducing to a very narrow band. So that doesn't mean that we don't need to carry reserves because the uncertainty reduces. There is an associated change in variability to this to reach to this point. So we can see, like, for instance, between hour 14 and hour 15 here, there's a huge rate of change in the production of solar. And if it's, as Dan was mentioning, a system that is relying heavily on solar, these will induce very large ramps into system operation. And the opposite holds when the eclipse ends and we start having these ramps up for solar production again. So what this means is that we need to really prepare in advance to tailor the best response for the system in terms of both uncertainty and ramping capabilities. In the next slide, we have an itemization of the different products that can be used to respond for that. Obviously, there are going to be upward and downward products. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the tools that we can use is the Dynador tool, which starts for dynamic assessment and determination of operating reserves, in which we can quantify how much reserve for given these two characteristics, which is uncertainty and variability, we need to carry in our systems in order to be able to accommodate these variations. On the left-hand side, we can see on the upper part, the upward capacity that we need to hold in our systems in order to accommodate the deviations. And on the lower side, we can see the downward capacity that we have to have. This again is using 1 hourly resolution. We can see that there are some changes there in terms of uncertainty. Particularly, it's more evident in the downward requirements that given the narrow uncertainty band during the eclipse, this probably may be reduced. But however, on the right-hand side, we can see the ramps that the system will undergo. And this is another requirement for flexibility and for, in the system. In the upper part, we have the upward, and in the lower part, we have the downward. And we can see that the system will experience significant upward ramps. And then as soon as the eclipse ends, we will start ramping down this requirement. And the opposite holds for the downward requirement. So this is, in general, the way in which the system can be prepared or should be prepared for that. Again, I insist that this is using a resolution of 1 hour, which is unrealistic given that the longest eclipse has lasted for around 7 minutes and a half. So you are better off obtaining probabilistic forecasts with increased resolution, like say 5 minutes, and then assume these requirements within a single product, like and then this variation of the eclipse will happen within the scheduling interval, and then your capacity for that will be significantly increased. So back to you, David.
Great. Thanks, Miguel. So one thing we also want to highlight is there's a lot of research around eclipses and operating and a lot of things we discussed today. For folks that aren't familiar, EPRI is a nonprofit research organization. We do research in a lot of different areas, and we work with utilities and ISOs about items of how to meet these challenges for things like the eclipse, but also other items that are coming up as the grid continues to evolve. So that's things like work on improving forecasts, things like Miguel mentioned about how do you determine reserves and those scheduling considerations. We also have things about how do you assess systems to know whether they're going to be able to handle events such as this. And there's many more items. We could have a whole presentation on all the great research that we have at EPRI, but just want to highlight that a lot of people working on this were very involved with a lot of different research, and would be happy to have conversations with folks. One thing I do want to call out specifically is on EPRI's load forecasting initiative, which is something that we recently launched to address some of these critical research items related to forecasting, both for things like these extreme events where you have these big drops in generation and you need to think through those, but also more on the longer term, the planning time scale. So things like as you're getting these data centers coming into a lot of places, and how do you incorporate that into planning, or as you're dealing with different extreme weather, or you're incorporating climate change info. So we've got a lot of great research on this. If you're a utility member or an ISO and you're not already connected with us on this, feel free to get in touch. But you're going to be seeing lots of additional work coming out about this over the coming months and years. So we went through a lot of the material, and we went through it pretty quickly so that we can leave time for questions. I will say that if you have questions, we have the Slido Q&A open. If you're having any problems with that, you can also ask it in the chat, and we'll make sure to go through and ask to answer some of those questions. But I would say if you're taking one thing away from this presentation, I think there's three main points I would like you to come away with. First, the eclipse is expected to cause noticeable impacts to the grid, but operators are prepared for this. They've been preparing for a while. They have the tools needed to deal with these sort of events. So it will be noticeable, but people are prepared. The other part is this is going to be a great preview for some things that we as the industry need to be thinking about, where you're having a lot of these different resources that are changing, things like more solar, wind, electric vehicles, etc. And they could undergo these sort of events where you have a big storm or something else. And so this is a sort of it's going to be a nice control case to learn from and improve things going forward. With that said, there's still lots of open questions about improving forecasting and operating during other events that maybe are going to be less predictable. We at EPRI are working on a lot of these topics and working with utilities and ISOs, et cetera, to really address these items so we can continue the safe, economic, and efficient operation of the electric grid. So with that, we're going to kick it over to Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also add them to Slido, and then we'll go through and address those. And we've got a great group of people here, so we can answer questions. And if we don't have an immediate answer, we can always follow up with you. So Aidan and others, any questions popping up to address first?
Hey, David, and maybe ask two questions that I see coming up. Maybe the first one, Dan, you could start with, and others may have thoughts around the load. Obviously, we showed the kind of solar, which is the most obvious impact when we think about it, because we talk so much about the amount of solar coming into the system, and it's a pretty obvious reduction. But we do see the impacts on load as well. I think Jack points out in 2017 they saw that, and I remember seeing some similar things in different parts of the country back in the 2017 one, and other parts of the world more recently. So I don't know, Dan, if you've thoughts on what the load potential, maybe not necessarily the magnitude or anything like that, but at least the kind of what are the potential implications on the meteorological variables that drive load, and anything you've seen there in the past.
Sure. In past eclipses, in areas where it's been clear, you can get up to 5-6 degrees Fahrenheit, even up to 8 or 9 in some occasions, cooling during the eclipse. This particular time of year, we're in shoulder season, and the hotter parts of the eclipse path in Texas are likely to be cloudy, so they probably won't see that very much. But there are definitely there are going to be some warm places where people have their air conditioners on, where they'll observe a few degrees of cooling, and they probably ought to be thinking about that, because it's not clear that the numerical weather prediction models are accounting for the eclipse in the temperature forecast.
That's a good point. I might just mention as well, just before I get to the next question, that the implications on wind, I know there's a potential implication there as well.
Sure, it's, this is a big area. It's comparable to the scale, it's balanced scales of motion of the atmosphere. So you cool an area like that, it's going to have some pressure implications, and you'll get changes in the wind around the periphery of the shadow area. There have been some papers showing like convergence zones kind of at the edge of the shadow, and extra convective activity there, big thunderstorms that pop up kind of around the border of the sunny and obscured region.
Thanks, Tom. Then maybe Miguel could start on this. I've got some thoughts too, or David, on the other question in the chat here. And folks, do keep adding if you need to in the chat if Slido's not working. But curtailment from solar assets. So the idea of kind of pre-curtailing, so that when you do get that large reduction, it's somewhat set up a little bit better. I know, again, past events, we certainly saw some of that. It depends on the nature of the market, the nature of the utility, but there might be opportunities there to do some kind of pre-curtailment. And I think as we expand on that, even things like energy storage and pre-charging of storage to make sure you've got the storage available. So Miguel, I don't know if there's any thoughts you have there on some of the work we've been doing around that issue of using flexible solar, and how you can use it for eclipses, but more generally for kind of ramping, and then using it to support some of the flexibility of the system.
Absolutely, I think you're spot on, and it depends entirely on how the system is set up and what are the kind of contractual agreements that they have as well with producers. But yeah, you can reduce solar, and then you would operate the system as the trivial answer would be to curtail the whole thing, and then you just have to deal with nothing, with just the changes on potential load that was mentioning, with changes in temperature and potentially load changes because of different consumptions during the period. The degree to that is to which you want to do that. It also depends on a system specific. There might be an amount that you can safely curtail in order to bring up generation, to have it on standby and spinning, and then just redispatch as conditions go back to normal. Those and storage, as you mentioned, Aidan, that's also a very important one. Potentially change the nature in which storage is operated on that particular point, if the system operator have access to that, and then just make it fully available during that period, and then smooth out the output of the combined solar and storage to the system, so that the impact on the thermal generation is as low as possible. All those are actions that can or may have been taken by some of members, but one of the things that I want to mention is that we have the information of how the solar will impact. So if we just make the operating plans in advance in order to accommodate that condition, there shouldn't be a major problem. It's not like we get into unknown territory. We are able to draw the operating plans to accommodate those ramps in advance, and it's a well-controlled event. It's not like it will change dramatically in time or in magnitude. So it can be accommodated successfully with adequate operational planning.
Thanks, Miguel. That makes a lot of sense. Not seeing a whole lot of other questions. I might have one more, maybe David, and I can get thoughts first. I see where Jared put in a comment as well about
but actually, I know the answer for that. If I could start, Aidan, or
go ahead.
So we had a question from Jared from NCAR about, we made a comment about weather forecasts and other forecasts and how they account for the eclipse. So there, as far as we are aware, two numerical weather prediction models from NOAA, the HRRR model, the high resolution rapid refresh, and the rapid refresh model, RAP, those do account for the eclipse directly. And so those will be very insightful. for most other models, they do not directly account for the eclipse. So people are making those adjustments. And as we've talked about, the eclipse and its position, everything is very well understood. A lot of the uncertainty is more going to be around localized weather, cloud cover, etc. But yeah, a couple of those models do have it accounted for. Most just don't.
Thanks, David. I want to re-emphasize one point you made, and then maybe have one last question for David and Dan and Miguel if you have time. But read a second point on the screen right now, that aspect of what this tells us. You know, we are adding more and more wind and solar to the system every year. Most projections show that continuing to happen across the next decade and more. So one of the things I think that's going to be really helpful with this is, while the ramps that you might see due to solar eclipses are very predictable and maybe potentially from an order percentage of capacity roughly the same as, or sorry, a lot higher than what you might see due to something like cloud cover. As we add more and more solar, the actual megawatt changes are going to be very similar to what you're seeing this next week. And so we're going to start seeing, and it's not going to be as predictable. So we're going to need to think about how we're going to be able to use that flexibility we have in the system, the types of things that we talked about earlier that folks are doing. So I think that's really important. I do want to just finish off by asking folks, maybe in the three folks here, what are you going to be watching for next week in terms of before, during, after the eclipse? So maybe Dan, we can start with you, and then David, then Miguel.
Well, I'm going to be in Vermont actually watching the eclipse, but after the fact, I will be very interested just to go and look at some of the nice resources that are out there, like Grid Status IO, and have a nice comparison of what all the solar generation and load numbers look. Yeah, I'll be really interested to see if despite the fact that the forecast in most of the grids that I've looked at is going to be pretty moderate on Monday, maybe in Texas, if it went to being a bit clearer than expected, to see if we can see a load signal. Be also interesting to see in some of the zones where there's going to be really a much larger population than usual, like upstate New York, a few other places that are pretty quiet most of the time, whether we can see any signs of increased activity in the load profiles.
Yeah, I would say the thing I think is going to be very interesting is, I'm curious about the forecast performance, but I'm also very curious about all of these behind the meter resources that there isn't great telemetry for, and seeing how those factor in, because not only do we have a lot more grid scale solar, we also have a lot more of that behind the meter. And it'll be interesting to see what's different or the same compared to previous eclipses.
For me, I think one of the things that I would be looking at in a post event would be how the system capitalize on geographical diversity of resources to respond to the eclipse. I think the eclipse has a very well-defined footprint, and then there is going to be specific areas that will be affected, but there are going to be other areas that will not, and then they can support the operating planning of the system. So that's another level of resources that they have and that they can use for, and I'm curious about how are they, if there are the strategies that they will deploy for these conditions.
Thanks, Miguel. Thanks, folks. Yeah, with that, I think we're pretty much at the top of the hour. I'll probably just close it out there. Appreciate everyone's engagement. Let us know. You have the contact details on the screen here. Let us know if you have any follow-up questions. We'd love to hear from the folks who are actually experiencing this. So if you're a system operator and have information you'd like to share with us next week, either get on a call or send some data, please do. We'd be doing some kind of post-event analysis, as some of the folks have said. So if you have something like that, please do reach out to David or myself, and we can certainly help you with some of the analysis, or it'd be good to share what's happened across the country. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day, and enjoy the eclipse if you're going to travel for it.
Thanks, everyone.